pocket queens really are the red-headed stepchild of premium pocket pairs. When you're dealt aces or kings, everything's all good. Jacks and tens, yeah, you expect it's going to be pretty awkward. But pocket queens, kind of smack dab in the middle. Let's talk about this hand today. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and welcome back to another video in the Science of Poker series, where we analyze popular starting hands from a technical level and give you some tips for playing these hands even better. Now, pocket queens is an interesting starting hand because there are only two starting hands stronger than it, right? Pocket aces and pocket kings. Queens is a favorite over ace king suited, and of course every other starting hand as well. But where I think people kind of go wonky with this hand, at least a little bit, is that they really make their decision about how they feel about queens after the flop, right? When they have an overpair, cool, life is good. When there's an overcard, well, damn it, and now queen sucks. Now in a moment we'll talk about how often that overcard is actually going to happen when you have pocket queens, but before we get there, let's talk about some of the things you should expect with this hand. Number one is the pocket queen should definitely be one of the biggest winning hands in your database overall. Number two, your pre-flop decisions are usually going to be maximally aggressive, which means 3-betting, which means 4-betting, all that fun stuff. And then number three is your post-flop win rate is going to heavily depend on your ability to play strong second pair hands very well. Of course, playing overpairs is also going to be important, but knowing how to play the second pair hands is going to be very, very crucial. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's do some technical analysis on this hand just so we really understand how pocket queens is going to hit flops. So we can use Flopzilla Pro for this, and if we pop in pocket queens over here, we can see the entire analysis of how it hits across all possible flops right here in the center. And if we first look at smashes, which I would consider 2-pair or better, you notice that's happening 12% of the time. And for what it's worth, if you're in here and you're like, why is there no 2-pair? Of course, the board could be like 8-8-4. That's simply because Flopzilla only considers it 2-pair if you're using both of your whole cards, which I think is decently fair. Then if we go over here and also include single pair hands, which is going to be everything from third pair to pocket pairs below middle pair, which would be an ace king X board. And then also that's going to include things like second pair and of course over pairs as well. Notice that's happening the other chunk of the time. And we can also just include draws here real quick, flush draws, open and straight draws, and also gut shots, and you notice that that's happening roughly 5% of the time. Now, of course, this is not going to totally add up to 105% hits. Rather, there's going to be some overlap because some of these draws are going to be included in the times that also has something like 1 pair, right? If queens on a jack 10-9 board, that's an overpair and also an open-ended straight draw. So that's the way that you would want to think about this when you're looking at the overall numbers. So while we're sitting here looking at the analysis of how pocket queens hits all flops overall, let's talk about a couple specific things. First and foremost, you should notice right off the bat the queen is going to smash about 12% of the time. This is standard across all pocket pairs. Most of that is going to be sets. Some chunk of that is going to be flopped boats. Some of it is going to be flopped quads, which doesn't happen very often, but this is standard across all pocket pairs. But the big thing to keep in mind is that when queens does smash and catches something like top set, well, that's usually not going to be super great for getting paid off. Your opponent, maybe has some sort of draw or something like that, but you typically have board lock when you flop top set, and as such don't expect massive payoffs. Your really large payoff potential is going to be when you flop a set and your opponent happens to flop top pair. So something like an ace queen X board or a king queen X board are typically going to be your big payoff possibilities. Just note that this doesn't happen a tremendous amount of time. It's only happening around 3%. And while we're on the subject of ace and king high boards, let's talk about the elephant in the room when we have pocket queens and the board comes ace XX or king XX without a queen on it. Notice first and foremost, this is happening 34% of the time, which is pretty eye-opening and shocking for most players, since some players tend to think that this happens about 100% of the time. Oh, I have queens and the board comes ace high. Yeah, LOL. And then others think this happens about 5% of the time, and that it's a huge rarity when the flop comes ace high, which of course it isn't that much of a rarity as we can see here. But there are a couple important things to note when the board does come with an overcard and no queen on it. First and foremost, that the solver tends to like checking queens behind in single raise pots on these kind of boards, and then also the solver tends to continue at least once when facing bets out of position in 3-bet pots on these boards. Keep those factors in mind. Alright, so now that we've done the technical analysis of this hand, I want to give you some pre-flop tips with pocket queens and also some post-flop tips with pocket queens. Let's get started with pre-flop first. Tip number one is one that I've been repeating a lot recently, and that's just be aggressive with this hand. If you find yourself taking a lot of passive actions pre-flop, or even worse, limping it, please stop. Immediately. Play it aggressively. Thank you. Preflop tip number 2 is to make sure that you are 3-betting more often as the default. Again, continuing with that aggression. And you'll notice this very quickly if you're poking around in the GTO Ranges app from Red Chip Poker. You're definitely going to notice that this is pretty much a pure 3-bet with pocket queens and the 6-max RGTO solve. In the live RGTO solve, the queens is typically a mix between calling and 3-betting in on steel pots, but in steel pots this is definitely still going to be a default 3-bet. But that being said, even though the solver likes mixing between calling and 3-betting with pocket queens, I would definitely suggest from an exploitative point of view, you just default 3-bet it. You can come up with certain reasons and justifications for taking a calling approach or mixing in calls, but in most smaller games where your opponents are playing very poorly and also very predictably against 3-bets, 3-betting is typically going to print more money, so I would highly suggest doing that as a default if you're not already. And number 3 is to remember that your edge is not in trying to find folds against 3-bets. There are honestly too many players that spend a crazy amount of time and energy focused on trying to find folds with queens facing a 3-bet. Now look, if your opponent is 94 years old, has never 3-bet a day in their life without kings or aces, yeah, sure, we can talk about it. But most of the time, this should definitely be a continuance against 3-bets. If you're spending a lot of time trying to find folds, I'd highly suggest spending that time elsewhere. Now I'll leave you with a quick note if you're still poking around over in the GTO Ranges app. If you're looking through the 6-max config, this is usually going to be a continuance mix between 4-betting and flatting the 3-bet, both in position and out of position, with the larger chunk of the mix being a 4-bet versus calling. But in the full ring configuration, or the live configuration, the mix is going to swing the other way, and it tends to have the larger chunk of the mix being the call as opposed to the 4-bet. But this also makes sense since the default 3-betting range in the solver is definitely going to be different between the full ring and also the 6-max solves. Alright, so now let's jump over to some post-flop tips with pocket queens. Number 1 is that top set on a dry board is usually going to be a slow play on the flop. Like we talked about earlier, when you have pocket queens and flop top set, you typically have board lock. There's not a ton of second best hands your opponents are going to continue with, and especially not ones that are going to give you 3 streets of value very often. So as such, this usually becomes a check behind or just a check in general when you flop top set again on that drier board. Number 2 is that middle set tends to be a 3-street hand. In general, it's usually going to be better value to try to get 3 streets of value when your opponent has top pair that just gets really sticky for 3 streets than it is to try to get maybe a single bet or bluff off of the rest of your opponent's range. Again, this can be opponent specific and even board specific, but as a general tip, I would typically try to go bang 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 when you do flop middle set. Number 3 is that overpairs are usually 2-street hands according to the solver. Now of course this is going to depend massively on exactly how the board rolls out and exactly who your opponent is, but the solver is typically going to go 1 pair. Hands tend to be kind of the cusp for going for 3 streets, so overpairs like queens, usually some sort of mix, sometimes favoring a little bit more towards checking, but that's against the solver. When you're playing against fish, of course you should definitely be looking for 3 streets most of the time, assuming the board doesn't totally crap out on you, but definitely be wary of raises from passive fish post-flop, since that can oftentimes be indicative that your queens is actually smoked with just 1 pair. And then the final post-flop tip I have for you with pocket queens is to think about those times you have second pair. Again, the board comes ace XX or king XX with no queen on it. These are the kind of spots where I would definitely suggest as a default, again, playing it a little bit more passive. It's very, very common for the solver to do this as well, and the way that I kind of think about it, not that the solver would use this kind of language of course, but the way I think about it is that it's better to strengthen up your passive range than it is to weaken out your aggressive range when you have something like second pair, especially something like queens on this kind of board. So keep that in mind, and hopefully that helps you the times that again you face that overcard on the flop, which of course is going to happen a very non-zero percentage of the time. Now if you want to go a little bit deeper, especially with some of these post-flop tips, I would definitely suggest watching that video next. I analyzed 2 different rivers with you, one good, one bad when we have pocket queens, and it's definitely a must watch. Otherwise, if you don't want to watch that one, watch this over here and continue watching more videos from the Science of Poker Hands playlist. And either way, I really hope you enjoy. If you enjoyed the video, thumbs up would be massively appreciated. Otherwise, I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.